I just hit record and the air conditioning came on. Good start. Hey everybody, my name is Patches and welcome to my YouTube page. I'm going to start posting more reviews of true crime documentaries that I've been watching or anything morbidly curious. The name Morbidly Curious I stole from my own book club, which if you're interested, you are welcome to join. It's an 18+ nonfiction book club where we read the macabre, life, death, science, anything weird and itches that morbidly curious part of your brain. The link will be in my bio for that. Pretty much the only thing I use my streaming subscription services for is true crime documentaries. I figured might as well start reviewing these. I would like to post these weekly, ideally, because again, that's all I watch and read. If you have any recommendations, please put them in the comments. I would love to check them out. Even if I've watched it before, I'd happily watch it again and give it a review. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, go ahead and subscribe, give it a like, comment, share. You know how YouTube works. Just do the thing. This week we are talking about Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. This is a 4-part docuseries that released pretty recently on Netflix. Going into the FLDS Church, okay, I mess this up every time. Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints. Fundamentalist, no, that's not right. Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints, that is right. This is like one of those cans of worms, but it's not just a can of worms. You know those toys when you open and like things shoot out and spring out of it? That's kind of like what this is. This is a really fascinating docu-series that I thoroughly enjoyed. I would highly recommend it. A lot of websites have said that this is a 16+ docu-series. I'd bump that up to 18. I would bump that up to an 18+. There's a lot of really heavy topics in this, and it's something I haven't done in a while, which is have to pause the documentary and go take like a lap around the neighborhood to kind of cool myself off. But with that being said, I would recommend it. I thought it was very well done, and it does a lot of things that I appreciate in documentaries or docu-series, where we break the fourth wall with the producer and we hear the producer's questions. It had wonderful reenactment scenes that felt very realistic, and it had great footage back in, you know, the day or whatever that this was happening, which, spoiler, it still is. It's got a 7.4 out of 10 on IMDb, 91% on Rotten Tomatoes, and a lot of articles have come out recently about how this docuseries is worth your time. I would agree. And I just knew that this was going to be interesting when it started off with a black screen title, Ephesians. Oh my god, is that how you say that? Ephesians 5:22, the Bible verse about, you know, wives having to submit themselves to their husbands. And I was like, this is going to be awesome. We start getting some names thrown at us and like FLDS and little bits and pieces here, and then once that intro kind of settles is when they start to explain a little bit of everything. I'm actually looking at the FLDSmormons.com website, which is kind of interesting, really explaining how different FLDS is from Mormons and how they really trying to separate themselves, and I think it's just a church and then the extremists. Kind of, you know, like Westboro Baptist Church is not all Christians type of thing. But according to this website, the FLDS broke away from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints around 1889. They chose not to accept the prophet of that time, Wilford Woodruff, which is one interesting name. Two, really interesting because that kind of plays a part into this docu-series. Chose not to accept this prophet as their leader because they are unwilling to accept that polygamy as a church practice has ended. Those who rejected the cancellation of polygamy through Revelation moved away from their own communities. I believe that's supposed to say from, not form. Groups split off several times, and today there are a number of groups practicing polygamy. This is true. There's almost 6,000 to 10,000 still active members in the FLDS Church. That is a number I did see online. If that is different anywhere else, please let me know in the comments. None of which are part of the original church. That's kind of like what I'm saying. They've branched off into this extreme theology, and it's very harmful and very dangerous, and we definitely see that here in this documentary. So why exactly polygamy? What the heck is going on with that? The FLDS believes that more wives equal, of course, more children, and the more wives you have, at least 3 or more, is how prestigious, I guess, you would be, or how high your ranking will be in heaven. It's kind of like your ticket to ensure that you get the best seat in the house. And of course, again, with that Bible verse that was stated at the beginning, it is much of just women submitting themselves 100%. And there was a quote in this documentary about how the FLDS see women as cattle. It's like livestock. They're here to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to be obedient wives and provide babies. And the docuseries shows Warren Jeff's ultimate downfall, and him eventually being convicted for his heinous crimes. Right when this documentary starts to get going, we meet a couple of different talking heads, and then their lower third will say their name along with former FLDS member or something along those lines. And you will hear them say things like, I'm one of 19 children, or I had 62 brothers and sisters, and it's quite alarming, and they show you these family trees of just how extensive this family is, and as wide as it is out here, it kind of just comes together with only a couple of different men, and it's very icky. We eventually learn the title of Keep Sweet, Pray, and Obey, as this one compound actually on their chimneys has written Keep Sweet on one side, Pray, Obey on the other. And this idea is to just don't ask questions, keep sweet, specifically to women. This doesn't involve the men at all. To women, keep sweet, just forget it. Don't have any issues. Listen to your prophet, listen to your God, pray and obey. So that's where the title's from. The Mormon Church outlawed polygamy hundreds of years ago, as we heard, in this separatist group that has just steered clear of all things Mormon and has taken on a new lead of kind of this religion. And it's got interesting ideas similar to what we hear in more extreme groups of religion, such as Scientology, where there is excommunication, there's words for people who decide to leave the church, and phrases such as apostates. But that ideology that people who don't believe in what you believe in, no matter who they are, whether it be family or friends, whatever, they are going straight to hell. They are listening to Satan, they are, which Scientology doesn't believe in any of that, but there is ideas in Scientology where if you want to leave the church, you are excommunicated from. You are not a part of that family anymore, or that friend group, or whatever. You are now seen as a horrible person, just to say it lightly. But the FLDS essentially saw the Mormon Church as not enough, and they wanted to continue this polygamy. Because, again, they thought the more wives, the more the merrier, the more children's, the better off you are in heaven. And they claimed that Christ wanted plural marriages. He wanted many wives, and he said in his word that this is the way to life, and this is the way to get you that seat in heaven. And they have this prophet. This is their God. This is who God speaks to directly to lead those in the church. And at the time, this was Rulon Jeffs. And they swore that this man would never die, despite him being as old as time. He knew everything. He was always listening. And the people that were higher up in the church had eyes everywhere and were listening all the time and would report back to their prophet of any wrongdoings. Once children got to a certain age, their fathers would take them to the prophet and say, "This is my child," which sometimes would even be as young as 12, 13, 14 years old, and say they are ready to be wed into the church. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they would get married to the prophet, which was such a huge honor in the FLDS church. You were married to the prophet, the guy. That was what you essentially wanted, but if not, they would most likely marry you off to somebody else in the church, even your cousin. Didn't really matter. Whatever God told the prophet was what went. And if you questioned it, you were questioning God, which no one would ever do, right? We see some people later on do that. In fact, it did not turn out well for them. And they called these arranged marriages the placement principle. And sometimes these people didn't even know who they were marrying until like a day before. And then suddenly have to love this person, submit to this person, be married and have kids to this person. Some women claim that Rulon Jeffs himself, the prophet, had this secret handshake that if he grabbed your hand like 3 times a certain way, that meant he wanted to marry you, which again, huge honor. And get this, there's a couple of people that we meet, Alicia being one of them. She was married to the prophet, who had around 23 wives. Alicia was 20 when she married the prophet. He was 86. And every night before bed, all of these wives would line up and give Rulon a goodnight kiss, and sometimes he would ask you to stay behind. And here's the problem with that. A lot of problems with that. But here's one of the main problems with that. These women are asked to submit to their husbands, however, they are not taught exactly how sex works, what sex is, or how to consent to it. Again, some of these people are children being forced to go through with this, and again, they get yelled at if they disagree with it because they are going against God, which is this almighty power that's going to smite you if you disagree with anything. Terrifying to these people, right? Again, this is where we begin to hear the phrase keep sweet. Keep sweet no matter what. Road to perfection is essentially what Rulon Jeffs would say. If you questioned it at all, it was like, shh, keep sweet. Eventually, we start to learn a little bit more about what women were supposed to do in FLDS. They had to dress a certain way, they had to style their hair a very specific way, and they weren't really in school. They were just trained to be good wives and cook and clean and be there for their husbands whenever their husbands needed it. On August 8th, 1998, Rulon had a massive stroke. He was very disoriented, he wasn't getting any words from God, and people started to panic because, again, this man wasn't supposed to die. But he does, because he's human. But this really scared the people in the FLDS church. This was their prophet. Who the heck was supposed to tell them what to do now? And this is when one of Rulon's children, Warren Jeffs, steps up to the plate. Once Rulon dies, Warren actually becomes the self-appointed prophet, but he would talk to Rulon's wives on the side and be like, I really think I should do this. Don't you think I should do this? Don't you think I should be the prophet? And would kind of plant this idea in their head, and then in front of many people would ask, who do you think should be the prophet? And of course at this point all the wives are like, well, I guess you, Warren. And Warren really took this church and drove it straight into the ground as if it wasn't already headed in that direction. He believed that the Olympics coming to Salt Lake City were going to be the end times, and he had everybody prepare and everybody move. Prepare ye, for the great day of judgment is upon us, and those judgments are going to be furious. My handwriting sucks. All of you are not going to survive. Which, again, just instilled this fear in people that they weren't good enough. And you hear these people now, these talking heads and these people that were former members say, I was scared all the time because I just didn't feel good enough. So ultimately they wanted to move because Warren believed that Salt Lake City would ultimately be destroyed by the Olympics. There would be this big ball of fire, and if they weren't saved, if they didn't have enough wives, you're done for. So they go to a place called Short Creek. It's Creek, but everybody called it Crick. Wherever you're from, I don't care. They all moved, they all sold everything they could, and just took off for the hills. Of course, nothing happened. The Olympics happened and no big ball of fire, nobody died, no end times, no revelations, whatever. But now they're in this new place. But what is super scary about now Short Creek is that the law enforcement, the fire department, security, anything happening in the perimeter of this area or anybody in charge was handpicked by Warren himself and were members of the church. There was really no escaping, which is really tricky to... When people see cults or people see these type of groups of people, they always suspect or say, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you escape? Why didn't you just walk away? There's so many things described in this documentary that explain this perfectly and why it was nearly impossible. There were eyes everywhere. You couldn't trust anybody to listen to you unless it was another member in the church. And if you guys were gossiping, you didn't know if that person was going to tell somebody else higher up and you would get in serious trouble. You really couldn't leave. They were watching all the time. And their teachings, starting at what we learned 6 years old, all the way up until, you know, whenever they die, is that the outside world is evil. It's dangerous. Plus, if you're living on this compound where everything is cooked there and you're farming and you're growing, and then suddenly you go into the outside world, where the hell are you gonna go? You don't have any money. You don't have anything on you. You're just basically bred into this lifestyle and you're stuck. Where the heck are they supposed to go? I understand that mentality of people saying like, those people are crazy. They're thinking the same thing about us. Where the hell are they gonna go? You know what I mean? And I think this documentary does that very well. I keep calling it a documentary, it's a docuseries. I think this docuseries does this very well in explaining this to people and showing this ideology that you can't just up and leave. You really can't. Some people did it. Some people accomplished it, went and got jobs at, you know, diners and were able to make some money and were living in like these halfway... I get it. It's possible, but it is so tricky. You're also leaving family behind. I just went off on a tangent. I just had to get that off my chest. Eventually, Rulon died on September 8th, 2002. They had this really interesting picture up of Rulon on his deathbed where all 65 of his wives were surrounding him and they all wore white, and it's this wild picture of them all just standing there with their dead husband. Warren needed something to do with all the wives, and he actually started marrying some of them, which would in fact be his own mothers. If you look at it on the family tree, it was actually his mothers and some of his relatives that he was marrying and wanted essentially all of Rulon's wives. Things started to get very strict once Warren was in power. He changed the dress code and made women wear like these pastel colors instead of whatever color they wanted. Their hairstyles had to be very specific. They did not put on any more plays. They were not allowed to watch most videos or read news. They didn't even know who the president was at the time. And no guns, which was a big issue for some of the FLDS members. No denim, no prints. They had to wear this long underwear, be completely covered, and their hair up in this very specific style. Some of these talking heads even describe that they weren't necessarily scared of dying, they were scared of disobeying. It became so strict that they were more concerned about repercussions on if they accidentally did something wrong than dying. We meet quite a few interesting talking heads in this, not just former FLDS members, but also some people who were just fixed on tearing this church down. We actually meet a bounty hunter named Sam Brower, who was fantastic, and we meet some other amazing talking heads later on, but he said that the FLDS is the #1 domestic human traffickers in the country. And like I mentioned earlier, they were running their own manufacturing and agricultural businesses. They had their own construction businesses, and they were basically putting FLDS men to work and making them give all of their wages up, which is a huge red flag in cults. Put a pin in that. Warren started to see some of his own siblings as a threat. He actually started kicking out a lot of boys and men of the church if he just didn't see any use for them. So a lot of these kids were just homeless. He literally kicked them out. We actually get to hear this really interesting love story between two people named Ruby and Joe, and how they really liked each other, but it was against God or the prophet's word for them to wed, and they were forced to marry different people. Joe was eventually kicked out of the church, and she was forced to have like 6 children, who we actually see in present day. Joe claims that his heart was just with the priesthood, and there was nothing he could really do to save Ruby. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. And probably the biggest figure in bringing down Warren Jeffs and the FLDS church, I say that, but I mean more so exposing, because like I said, the FLDS is still very active to this day, is a woman named Eliza. She and her sister Rebecca are actually interviewed. Eliza was, I believe, I have both of their names written down next to this number, at 14. They were Eliza was married off to her first cousin at 14 years old. And these weddings would actually happen in like this beat down abandoned motel kind of far away. Yeah, they would go to this place, Caliente, I believe, Nevada. It was called the Hot Springs Motel, to do these weddings. So maybe the law wouldn't be as extreme, or they wouldn't get in as much trouble, because again, this is illegal. Eliza claims that she was fighting for her life. She was screaming, crying, just did not want to marry this guy. This guy not only was her first cousin, but he was actually very mean to her growing up. She always had these just horrible memories of him. Eliza even went to Warren Jeffs, this prophet, and said, "I don't want to do this." And he says, "You cannot escape the responsibility the Lord has placed upon you." How terrifying is that? Along with the bounty hunter we met earlier, Sam Brower, we also meet a Mike Watkiss, who is a journalist and author, and he is quite the character, but we see him just putting in work, trying to take down this church and interviewing people. He's knocking on people's front doors, he's walking up on their doorstep, and he's asking the questions. Are there child brides in here? What is happening behind closed doors? And then the Short Creek officers that he would try and question were clueless, but you have to remember these guys are also FLDS members. So you know anything that goes to those officers is going to go straight to Warren Jeffs. Mike Watkiss even said that Warren was using God to justify actions and bully people. Along with Eliza that I mentioned earlier, again, her sister Rebecca was also quoted saying that Warren had told her to her face, "I will break you," because she started to question the ideas of the FLDS. "I will break you. You have had too much freedom for too long. I will train you to be a good wife." And again, leaving just meant damnation. You would be excommunicated. She would be leaving her sister and her family behind. Sisters. Excuse me. But eventually Rebecca did call up one of her brothers who had escaped as well, and they were able to reconvene and figure out a plan to get Rebecca out of there. And now she was this 26-year-old apostate. She was not allowed back in the FLDS. She wasn't allowed to communicate with anybody in the FLDS, and she was seen as an outsider. Eliza was stuck back at the FLDS, and now she is 14 years old. She is being raped by her cousin because she is forced to submit to her cousin that she is now wed to. And she had this really remarkable quote that said, "I was trying to find God in all of this," which just really stood out to me, because Think about it. Where the hell would he be in a situation like this? And again, she tried to go to Warren. She said, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't understand what's happening. And this is when he said, you know, submit. Your mind, body is sold to your husband. You are his property now. Along with Rebecca, Ruby also tried to escape. She was incredibly unhappy. She just wanted to be with Joe, but couldn't be. She also connected with a sibling that had left the church, and things were going well until Warren got word that Ruby ran away, and he called Joe and had Joe bring her back. He made all these promises about, if you bring Ruby back, I will let you two get married. It was horseshit. Basically, Joe brought Ruby back, and then Joe got kicked out of the church, and then Ruby was back forced into submission. Ruby actually had 6 kids by the age of 24. She says she loves her children, none were her choice, and she really resents her parents, which I totally understand. How can you raise somebody in your own ideologies and force them to do something like this? Especially when they're children. Like, I can't get over this. I can't get over it. I can't get over it. Again, law enforcement is doing nothing about this. Law enforcement in the area are members of the FLDS church. So Mike Watkis wanted to take this into his own hands and find victims. So he finds a victim named Ruth Stubbs, who was 16. She was given to a 32-year-old police officer. This police officer was a member of the FLDS church and had actually multiple wives. She was 16 years old. In Arizona, it is a crime to have kids at that age. Police officer's name was Rod Holm. He was eventually found guilty, but it was just a slap on the wrist. However, Mike Watkis says that this is very important because this got the ball kind of rolling and showed that people that you probably know have multiple wives and they are members of this fundamentalist church. Now, Warren Jeff sees that people are onto him and onto this idea, so he decides to pick up and move to a random place in Texas, which was just his worst career move of all time. That's a quote from Mike Watkis, which is so accurate because people in Texas know when you come in. Like, the small towns like that, specifically El Dorado, Texas, they know when somebody moves in, especially with the land that Warren Jeffs purchased. Huge. I mean, just huge, sprawling land. And then builds this temple on the land that you really can only see from the sky, but we actually get an interview from a pilot who saw this from the sky and was wondering what the hell was going on because they said that this was a corporate hunting retreat, which people in Texas were like, okay, checks out. But the pilot started taking pictures of it and he saw that people were working around the clock to get whatever the hell they were building built. You can't get away with anything in a small town. You can't get away with anything. People see this shit. They know. But also they noticed that whoever had moved into this area was very quiet and sheltered and wouldn't really speak to anybody, which was very strange because everybody's very friendly in the South. So if they see somebody they don't know in their small town, they're gonna probably say hello and be a friendly neighbor, and then they notice that nobody was saying hi back. Things start to get very scary for both the people in this part of Texas where they're calling it Zion, where the best of the FLDS go, which is as seen as like the next step to heaven, but also back in Short Creek, cameras are installed. They're watching every move. There's super tight security. They can't really go anywhere without anybody knowing where they're going. This really interesting part is a woman named Charlene who notices that her husband is taking quite a few of these business trips. She isn't really sure where he's going. One day in his truck, she writes down the mileage, and then once he comes back, she writes down the mileage and kind of calculates which direction he possibly could have been going. She also finds dirt on his tires that she doesn't recognize and starts to do research on this dirt and actually discovers that he is going to El Dorado, Texas. She didn't have the town specifically, but she knew he's going to Texas, which is really remarkable. So in 2004, Warren claims that there is another test coming. Similar to how the Olympics were happening and it was going to cause all hellfire to break loose, here's another test coming. Ever since the police officer was found guilty, but eventually again just slap on the wrist, Warren was kind of in hiding. He wasn't really coming in and out of the church, but he would show up every so often to do sermons or discussions. So one day he comes in again in 2004 saying that another test was coming. He says, "We are in a benevolent dictatorship." That's what he says. And then he says, "I'm going to read off a list of names that God gave me." He named probably 25 men out of a crowd of 3,500. He named very high-key men in the church that disagreed with his power. That at one point we hear in a talking head in present day say that he was just having a conversation with a guy about his daughter being married off. And this guy is saying, "I'm not giving my daughter to anybody until she's 18, which is against the prophet's words. So whoever he was talking to went and told Warren. So now Warren has a list of 25 guys' names who essentially said something along those lines. He kicked them out of the church right there. He had this weird power trip or power move to just smite all of these guys and weren't allowed to say bye to their families. They had to just pack up and leave. It's like 25 of the highest men in the church. And whatever wives or children that they had were like reassigned to different people. They were given to other families. So children didn't know their father anymore. They knew a different father. They knew somebody else. Everybody was stunned. Nobody really knew what was going on. Here's Warren, who they haven't seen in probably months at a time, is suddenly back kicking people out of the church. And the families believed it. They suddenly believed that all of a sudden all these guys are going in against the prophet. They must be of the devil. Warren is always right. Here's where we start to learn more about Zion. FLDS members would call these people that would just up and leave to Zion poofers because they would vanish in the middle of the night. Warren would pick certain people to come to Zion, which was just this temple in the middle of El Dorado, Texas. And sometimes they would literally vanish in the middle of the night. Children would vanish in the middle of the night. Women would come out and be like, where the hell did my child go? Somebody up and picked their child from bed and took them to a different state. Completely different state. But again, some people are happy about this because Zion was a place that you would go and would be hand-selected by the prophet. The other problem was nobody really knew where this was. We know it as El Dorado, Texas. Nobody knew where they were going, though. Zion was called the Yearning for Zion Ranch. YFZ, which is really a mouthful. I don't know why they landed on that. Here at Zion, the women that were chosen were basically just gardening, making food for men, and cleaning. The kids were in a school of some sort, but they were just basically learning the FLDS way. Nothing on the outside was taught inside. Sometimes they would take school books and cut pages out of them, especially if it was about science or anything remotely against their religion, and that's the textbooks that the children would read and would learn from. Zion eventually becomes a grooming ground. Children were being wed off into these older men just to have children and continue the FLDS lineage. And of course, some people in the documentary were saying that age really didn't matter and God was okay with it. This was God's way. This is what the prophet said. The locals of El Dorado, Texas, where Zion was located, really didn't like this. They really were uncomfortable with it, but some people were like, just let people do their thing, whatever, not realizing, I guess, what was actually happening behind closed doors. A lot of the papers were posting on it. Mike Watkins did not give up. He was still posting about it as well. And again, suddenly this very small town in Texas had a temple in it that was very creepy and heavily guarded. Eliza eventually left the church. Eliza actually one night had a flat tire, and this man in the FLDS church came to help her and assist her, and she actually wound up really liking this guy and kind of falling in love with him. And then word got out that she was an adulterer, so Warren Jeffs actually kicked her out of the FLDS. This is where she reconnected with Rebecca, her sister, and they actually went to law enforcement, which is finally, when there was a case against Warren Jeffs. Because Eliza was so young when she was married off, she was wed at 14 to her own cousin. So Warren was charged with 2 counts of rape as an accomplice. However, they couldn't find him. He fled. And for a point in time, he was added on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list along with Osama bin Laden. Of course, the members of the FLDS church were told this was all lies. People were coming for their God. People were coming for their prophet. It wasn't true. Meanwhile, they discover that during this time that Warren Jeffs is on the run, he's actually with a couple of his most faithful wives, and they are having a blast. They were going to Disney World. But back at his compounds, the people who were working and were making money were forced to give up all of their funds, and those funds were being sent to Warren Jeffs. Sometimes they would make the members cough up $1,000 a week. Doesn't matter how you get it, Warren needs your money, the prophet needs money. Sometimes they were sending Warren Jeffs $300,000 a week. A week. At first, Seth Jeffs, one of Warren Jeffs' brother, was actually arrested, and he was trying to transport money, but he was caught in Colorado for aiding and abetting a fugitive. And he was arrested and charged. He basically just got a slap on the wrist as well. So they had to change their transport. So they actually went to Costco and would buy in bulk these cans of like tomato juice, empty out the cans, shove like $50,000 in each of those cans, and that's how they would transport to Warren Jeffs. And again, he was getting almost $300,000 a week, sometimes more. Eventually, August 28th, 2006, Warren Jeffs is caught right outside of Las Vegas. He was in a vehicle with a couple of other people, some of those being his wives. The plates were obscured on the vehicle, which caused the officer to pull them over to let them know that their plates were obscured. Essentially, everybody in FLDS is told to just pray for him. Pray for Warren during this difficult time. They have the wrong guy. our prophet didn't do anything wrong. So now at this point, Eliza and Rebecca are filed under pseudonyms. They are known as Jane Doe. Eliza specifically was known as Jane Doe number 4. There was a lot of pressure on these two women because now they had to go into court, look at Warren Jeffs in the face, be in the same room as him, and testify against him, which is horrifying. This man that you once saw as your God, you are now testifying against in court. September 13th, 2007 was the trial. And Eliza actually gave this testimony, and the cameras were turned off, so there was some privacy because a lot of what she was talking about was just absolutely devastating, and the things that she was going through in the FLDS church. Outside of the courtroom, there was actually a SWAT team and snipers protecting the prosecution because there were rumors that they, I'm assuming they as like FLDS men, knew who the girls were that were testifying against Warren Jeffs, and they would, quote, do whatever it took to protect the prophet. There's a SWAT team outside the courthouse. And one of the things that was brought up was this whole idea of religious persecution. Like, they're coming for Warren Jeffs just because of his religious beliefs. Brock Belknap, I believe that's how you say his name, was the prosecutor who made clear, he said, quote, look, we aren't going after Warren Jeffs for religious views. We're going after Warren Jeffs because he facilitated the rape of a child. Bottom line, Warren Jeffs' team was coming for Eliza, saying that her story was improbable and, quote, it happened because she wanted it to happen. They were just grasping at straws. They had no case whatsoever. September 25th, 2007, the verdict is guilty beyond reasonable doubt, and he was facing 5 years to life. And Mike Watkis puts it perfectly where he says he's probably only going to get about 10 years. But this is still a good thing because it's putting his name out there and it's showing people and other victims to come forward that you could win against this person. He should be sentenced to life, there's no doubt about that. But we have a start. While in custody and in prison, Warren Jeffs is actually still maintaining and conducting sermons. You could see him in the phone booth with some of his wives. He's actually telling them things to say to the people, and he's actually, again, still to this day, conducting sermons from prison. They still genuinely believe that this is their prophet, despite him being behind bars and doing heinous crimes. Here's where things get kind of interesting in part 4. April 3rd, 2008, CPS is called. The sheriff, Dave Duran, I believe that's how you say their name, claims a call came from a crisis center regarding a girl who was 16 years old and a mother and was pregnant and was being abused, so they needed to do a welfare check. However, Texas Rangers traced this call and discovered it was actually coming out of Colorado. This was a hoax call. But by the time they get to Zion, they realize something is wrong. CPS found journals written by girls who were pregnant, very underage, and there they saw girls who were pregnant with their own eyes. Texas law, that is a crime. And they felt that the children at this property were in danger. April 4th, 2008, they surrounded the ranch, and there was a huge raid where they took children away from their families. Buses pulled up, no one wanted to leave. People at the FLDS reported that they thought that they were devils because they were all wearing black. They'd never seen people like this before. Children were scared, they were screaming, crying, throwing up. They did not know what was happening. They were being separated from their families. The judge ordered them to be taken off the ranch, and suddenly they realized how many people were actually in the FLDS group. They needed more buses. And now the FLDS was campaigning that the kids were being taken away from their will. Oprah Winfrey eventually showed up on the ranch, and they were doing interviews with Larry King and reporting that these families were being torn apart and nothing was wrong. They weren't participating in any underage. There was no underage brides. They were not subscribing to any of that information. But they were just lying about it. So they get the media's attention, and then the media gets a hold of it, and the media is saying, oh my gosh, these guys are separating families for, this religious group that's doing no wrong. They were lying. The number was 416 children were taken off of the ranch. And then once they were reconnected with their families, some of the kids didn't even recognize their own mothers. And a lot of the kids were terrified. I mean, how would you... I can't even imagine going through that as like a teenager. These were children. Children. Eventually, Texas ruled that all kids be returned to their families. But they still felt like they had something, so they eventually asked Eliza and Rebecca to help them in Zion or El Dorado, Texas. What can we do to get inside? And Rebecca said, inside, I guarantee you there's going to be reports and boxes of information, and it will have evidence that these underage weddings and child rapes were happening. So Rebecca and Eliza go down to the sheriff's office and they're taken to this temple. And then the FLDS men protected pretty much all the doors and they wouldn't let them in. One man actually fell to his knees in front of the sheriffs and was hoping and praying that lightning would strike them as soon as they tried and walked into the doors. I don't really have the correct notes here on exactly how the sheriffs got into the temple. I'm assuming there was a warrant, a judge somewhere issued this, because they do eventually get in and find horrible, horrible things in this temple. The 4th floor was bright white room with it looked ridiculous. Everything was white, from the carpets to the drapes, white. They discovered a white bed and it looked like an altar. It was all white. It's horrific. The basement, like Rebecca assumed, had a vault, and they were jackhammering this vault for hours, and they finally got in, and what did they find? Boxes and boxes of records that eventually would take Warren Jeffs down. In some of those boxes, though, they did find audio tapes, which contained the worst things I've probably listened to in a documentary, because the documentary actually plays some of them for you. These were played in court in the trial against Warren Jeffs. We didn't hear it all. The jurors did, though, and the jury apparently had, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but 10 women, 2 men. And Mike Watkis actually said that Warren Jeffs is probably lucky that there were Texas Rangers in that courthouse, because once the women heard what was happening, they probably would have killed him. And we get to hear a snippet of that. And it's very horrifying, but it is essentially a tape of a ritual where the sister wives are watching Warren Jeffs do things to a 12-year-old. Do the thing with a 12-year-old. 12 years old. Everything is in these records. Everything. Since Warren Jeffs' start as the prophet to present day, everything is in records, and they have proof of all of it. It was absolutely gut-wrenching to listen to, and I can't imagine what some of these people actually went through. It's revolting. Absolutely revolting. And they do eventually ask Warren, how many of these, quote, sacred sessions did you have? And he just kept saying no answer. He's found guilty on 2 counts, raping of a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old. Warren was found guilty of conducting the marriages of 67 underage girls to FLDS men. Warren himself had 78 wives, 24 of them were underage. He got 100+ years and 20+ to that. They really stacked him up. We didn't really hear like an official number in the documentary. We just heard that they gave him all of it. Just as much as they humanly could. And again, people still to this day believe that Warren is the prophet. This is actually something we see in a couple of different religious sects or cults like this. Waco comes to mind, the Branch Davidians. They are still an active cult, and they do believe, despite David Koresh being deceased, that he will eventually come back one day and that he is the Messiah, and yeah, he will come back. And unfortunately, at the end of the documentary, we hear from a couple of the people that we have heard from for the entirety of the documentary, like Charlene, Eliza, Alicia, Ruby, that a lot of people are still members. Ruby has no idea where her mother is. Eliza's mother is still in it herself. Charlene's 8 children, she has more than 8, but 8 of her children are actually still in the church, and they're completely cut off from all of these people because they are seen as apostates. And that concludes the Keep Sweet, Pray, and Obey docuseries. I thought it was very well done. I would give it probably a 4 out of 5 if I had to give it a rating. I'm still kind of deciding how I want to do these reviews. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me and listening to me rant about this group of people. If you like what you see, again, subscribe, give it a like, and let me know in the comments of anything I should watch or read next. I will totally do it. I don't know what I'm watching next week. People have responded to my posts online, so I will kind of see what they've been saying and go from there. Link in the bio, check out the description for all of my things, and I will see you guys next week. Take care.